Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everyone, both here in the room and online, to this seminar that is hosted by Jernkontoret and the Swedish Institute for Standards. My name is Åsa Ekdahl. I'm Head of Environment and Climate Change at the World Steel Association, and I will be your moderator for the day. So the title of this seminar is Decarbonization Standards in the Steel Industry. Why, what, and who? And that's what we'll be talking today, according to this program that is coming on the line now. Great. All right. So after my few words about the programs, we'll have some welcoming remarks, and after that, a keynote address. Then we'll have a scene-setting presentation to give you the context why we are talking about that and this and what is going on. After which we'll have two very interesting panel discussions. The first one will focus on the needs for standards and definitions, and the second one on how to move forward and who is best placed to take this forward. Before we end the day, we'll have a short session with reflections and conclusions. So that's really it. So to start, I would like to introduce and welcome Annika Roos, Managing Director of Jernkontoret, and Annika Andreasson, CEO of the Swedish Institute for Standards, to give you a welcoming address. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Åsa. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a big honor for me to welcome you to this seminar that Åsa mentioned on the topic decarbonization standards for the steel sector. I also would like to give a warm welcome to our eminent speakers and panelists that have joined us today here at Jernkontoret, but also some of you will participate online. So for everyone, big welcome. So as Åsa said, my name is Annika Roos and I'm the head of Jernkontoret, and that is the Swedish Steel Producers Association. It's an old association. We were created 1747, and since then we have been owned jointly by the steel companies in Sweden. So the theme of today, it's very important in general for the industry, and also it's a big public interest. So countries all around the world, today they are setting targets to fight the climate crisis and speed up the transition. And this is a priority for Europe and also very much for Sweden. This is also very important for the steel industry. So today we account for about 7% of the global CO2 emissions. And in Sweden this is actually a little bit higher, around 10% of the total Swedish emissions. And what's also happening is that demand on the production of steel is continuously increasing. So obviously, this is something we need to do about today. And we are doing a lot of things. If we look at the Swedish iron and steel industry, we are in the front line to meeting the global climate goals. And there are a lot of activities, high ambitions, new technologies being introduced, new products is also launched in the markets. So there are a lot of activities ongoing, and I think more or less all Swedish iron and steel companies, they are involved in different projects to reduce the carbon footprint, and using like hydrogen, electrification, bioenergy, biocoal, and a lot of different technologies. But how do we measure these efforts? How do we measure the carbon footprint? And how can we bring this forward in the future? These are all questions that we ask ourselves today. Last year, Jernkontoret conducted a survey or a project study and mapped the different initiatives that's ongoing related to standardization in this area. And we found that there are more than 40 different initiatives with different purposes and also different stakeholders. So there's definitely a need to look into this subject more deep. And with the discussions today, we really hope that we can address why a common view on the international decarbonization standard is necessary and how we can bring this forward. So I'm really looking forward to this day. Annika.
Thank you, Annika. My name is Annika too. A warm welcome to everyone. I'm very happy to stand here today. We've been planning this for quite some time now. My name is Annika Andreas, and then the CEO of the Swedish Institute for Standards, SIS. And SIS is the member of the Swedish member of the European Standardization Organization, SEN, and the International Standardization Organization, ISO. And we have been here for 100 years, so we are not 101 this year, I'm sorry. So we are not as old as you, but we have been here for quite some time. And what do? We develop standards together with the private and public sector. And I know we have a long relationship with Jernkontoret in doing so for this industry. Standards are jointly agreed solutions to recurrent needs. It's a strong tool, and we can find standards everywhere. From the simplest bolt to complex solution, for example, communication, data communication solutions. So it's a tool that's used very widely. We, together with the companies, authorities, and organizations, we can develop solutions to meet the global challenges of today, like the climate challenge we stand in front of. And I would also like to mention that ISO standards, through the technical barriers of trade agreement, enables international trade and leads to economic growth and reduces poverty. This is big words, but I think the TBT agreement is important to mention to this industry as it enables competitive growth for the industry as a whole. As Annika said, green transition of the steel sector is of high importance and will need to happen fast, and that will require common definitions, as you also mentioned, Annika. And today we have this broad range of initiatives that we need to line up, I would say, to be able to meet the needs we have. And here the formal standardization with ISO standards can actually be an important tool. So I would like to encourage everyone to engage actively in the formal standardization process. And I think also I would like to say, with help of international organizations and partnerships, it can be really strong. We have, for example, the IEA, the G7, and the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and US, that can together promote standards. It's important. The Swedish presidency of the European Council is hosting and organizing the next TTC meeting in Luleå at the end of this month. Let's see what we can bring to that meeting from these discussions today. And I'm, as Annika, looking forward to the discussions of today and see what it brings. And once again, warm welcome.
Yeah, well, why not? Thank you very much for those welcoming words. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker. It's Per-Arne Hjelmborn. Per-Arne is the Director General for Trade Policy at the Trade and Promotion Department of the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs. Welcome.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear Annikas, dear friends, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting and topical seminar, where I hope to share some reflections from the Swedish trade policy perspective. As an intensely traded good and fundamental material for so many different products and for so many different sectors, steel is often an interest of several policy areas. I'm thinking of anything from innovation to labor to environment to also the geopolitical issues, which we are covering very carefully the last decade. And the discussion here today will, of course, focus in a more limited way on these topics. I think of the focus today is the needs, the challenges, and the way forward for the decarbonization standards in the steel sector. But that's not a small task itself. So likewise, my intervention will also be more targeted, and I will highlight basically 3 points as I see them. Firstly, to install some sense of urgency of achieving a sustainable transition in the steel sector, and also which then hopefully could pave the way for a green transition of the economy. And secondly, the need for cooperation and partnering with key stakeholders and allies to stay competitive globally. And thirdly, and finally, an encouragement to all stakeholders to get actively engaged in the discussion to try to find joint solutions. So on the green transition, you all know, I think, in this room that this is one of the main priorities for the Swedish government and also for the whole European Union. A tangible illustration of this was that actually the first EU meeting that took place during the Swedish rotating presidency this semester was actually that it took place in Kiruna, Sweden's northernmost city, and a unique region within the EU where you can actually see the green industrial transition taking place. And it's also a region where the mining sector features very prominently. And the EU members, we have set a goal to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030 and to reach climate neutrality by 2050. As you all know, and as was mentioned earlier, iron and steel production accounts for somewhere between 6 and 8%, you said 7% of the annual CO2 emissions, and also, which is relevant, demand and production is still very high. So decarbonization of the steel industry will surely be essential to reach the goals of the climate agenda. And yes, that is a challenge, it's a huge challenge. But I also think that how many other materials that actually been produced for several thousand years can we say that we actually provide cutting-edge technology and that we actually can credibly claim that we are part of the solution to reach the net climate neutrality. Then on the partnering, the EU and its member states are not the only ones, obviously, who have the green transition high on the agenda. For example, the G7 has launched a global initiative to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the United States, I think we have some colleagues joining us online here, they also aim towards zeroing out the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So partnering with key allies to stay competitive globally is important. I think it's paramount and crucial. But we should also be fair to say in this room, and always when we discuss these hot topics, if you wish, it's sometimes problematic. It involves different policy issues, policy interests, which are always come into play in the steel sector and many others as well. However, I'm sure that you're all aware that the transatlantic link is key for Sweden, it's key for the European Union, and the EU, we must continue to build on our long-term relationship with the United States. And it was mentioned earlier, the Trade and Technology Council, the so-called TTC, is to this point the most important forum for our cooperation with the United States on this particular issue. And linked to this, it's also discussed in this context, is that the EU and the US are negotiating a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium, GSA, which we hope will be concluded in a manner that's according to both our interests, but also that it's consistent with the multilateral trading rules and the WTO. As mentioned at the outset, steel is a highly traded commodity, and it's really essential for our value chains. In the case of Sweden, actually, some 90% is exported, which means that's key for us to have market access abroad, and also that we have this global set of rules that can sort of feed into our interests. As was mentioned also by Annika, Sweden will host the next TTC meeting, and it's also taking place up in the far north, in Luleå, on May the 30th and 31st. And it gives us a fantastic opportunity once again to show in this transatlantic context that the green industrial revolution is actually taking place. And we can show what we're doing in mining, in batteries for electrical vehicles, and also in the fossil-free steel area. So Sweden is in the forefront, and we hope to be able to show that during these meetings. And speaking of partners and key allies, I would be amiss if I didn't mention the crown jewel of the European Union, which is, of course, the EU internal market, which is actually this year, I hope you've seen that, celebrate its 30th anniversary. And here, I must say that standards have played a key role in the development of the single market. I think it's fair to say that without standards, we wouldn't be in the same place in terms of the EU internal market. And it's clear to us that our common ambitions toward a climate neutral, resilient and circular economy cannot be delivered without European standards, and for that matter, also international standards. And as a part of our community, we wish to contribute to ensure the future competitiveness of sustainable EU exports and investment. And that brings me to my last point, active engagement by the stakeholders. Definitions and standards can contribute to build trust, both for companies along the value chains, but also among the end users, of course. And it's therefore of utmost importance that these become relevant and that they are usable, which requires active participation from industry, as well as clear anchoring among the industry, researchers, academy, and consumers, and actually, in fact, the whole society. We are aware that this requires enhanced efforts from all sides, including the governments which I represent. It is of utmost importance that we engage with stakeholders at the national and the European level, and also, I would say, between like-minded at the international level. And this should be done always, of course, in a constructive and an inclusive manner. Fossil-free, green steel, net zero, and what have you. A beloved child has many names. That's a very famous Swedish idiom, which you can use in this context. It was mentioned before that we are looking actually at some 40 different initiatives dealt with in as many different forums. So it's a proliferation that's enormous. And of course, it was mentioned that our host today, Jernkontoret, has mapped all these current initiatives in the steel sector. So there's not only one net zero steel standard, and the fragmentation is actually growing by the day. And that situation needs to be tackled. There are so many different standards and guidelines poses challenges for us with the green transition, and also for the competitiveness of Sweden and our industry. And there is a clear risk that this will create a fragmented market and unpredictability, which may at the end actually restrict and hamper international trade. So it's very important that we try to make the various standard initiatives comparable, and thus making them economically viable. So we need a way to speed up the standardization process and the way standards are actually used. We have to drive this and make it better and faster. Crucial is that we can get global standards in place, and that the ISO can play a key role together with European standardization. I'm therefore very pleased that the ISO is looking into the use of AI in their standardization process in order to be able to make the standards go faster. We are also able to look at alternative ways. I think that's always important to see different ways to proceed here to speed up things and also do it with quality. And one such example is actually the net zero guidelines presented by the ISO during COP27. It's not a standard, but actually a workshop agreement that will, I believe, will be very helpful to achieve the green transition. So, my friends, remember that it takes a village to raise a child, so all hands on deck are actually needed. Finally, and perhaps equally important, is that we need to have a strategic discussion, such as the one we're having here today. So we need to see where we need the standards, and now also we need a discussion how we position them globally. So therefore, I think that standards belong also in the boardrooms where the important decisions are taken. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, and I also look very much forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those encouraging words. Now we're going to move on with a scene-setting presentation, giving an overview of some of these initiatives that we heard about. So let me introduce Helene Axelsson. She's Energy and Environment Director at Jernkontoret.
Thank you, Åsa. This will just be a short introduction to give you some background towards the discussions we will have in the panels. And I'll start off with the products, because that's actually most important, isn't it? We usually say made of steel or made with steel, because almost everything in society depends on steel. And it's all around us. And the reason for that is that steel can have very many qualities and properties. Strength, durability, flexibility, resistance to corrosion. And all this means that steel can be useful in many different applications. You see some of them in the slides. And continuous improvements of these properties also means that efficiency and performance throughout the life cycle can be better and better. And as Per-Arne just mentioned, steel is highly traded. So steel really contributes to sustainability all over the world. And then to some steel basics. What we see here is the steel production for global steel production over the last 150 years. And today, or last year, the steel production globally was about 1.9 billion tons of steel. And as you see, the last 20 plus years, there's been an enormous increase in production. And since we build society with steel, and there's still a lot of places in the world to build, this curve will probably continue to rise. Steel can be produced from iron ore, but also from recycled steel. That is what we call scrap. When the car or the bridge or the can has reached its end of life. And these products have different lifetimes, but on average, the lifetime for steel in products is about 30-40 years. And going back to that production curve, you can notice that 30-40 years ago, the steel production globally was less than half of today's level. So we need both iron ore and scrap as a raw material to satisfy the needs of steel globally. But when you produce steel from iron ore, you need to reduce the iron ore, the oxide, to iron. And so far, we used carbon to do that. And this is the main cause of the large CO2 emissions that we have from steel production. So to be able to change this, we need new technologies, we need a lot of fossil-free electricity, biomass, and large investments. And we need it fast. There is a lot of stakeholders that realize the importance of steel industry, and also there is great interest in steel industry climate transition. And as been said earlier, during last year we had a project looking into all these initiatives and the enormous increase. We found around 40 different initiatives, and it continues to come new ones. There's a lot of different organizations, countries, companies, with the ambition to inspire, create roadmaps, develop policies, create partnerships, and a lot of different purposes. And it's really hard to get an overview and to sort of categorize these initiatives. And as you see, there's a big flower bush of initiatives. But one objective is finance and investments. The transition will require huge investments in steel industry, but also in related industries like energy production, infrastructure. So how to know where to invest your money? What criteria is needed for green bonds? That's one thing that is sort of dealt with in all these initiatives. Another objective is the need for developing technology and driving innovation. Scaling up and implementation of breakthrough technologies needs support, for example, for building a demonstration plant. And what projects should be supported by governments, and to what degree? One way of supporting the transition is through the market. And these are examples of some initiatives that aim to accelerate the transition by creating markets for steel with low emissions. The G7, and together with the IEA, have presented proposals on how the G7 countries can develop policies to lead the market lead the transition in heavy industries. We have industrial deep decarbonization, which is an initiative from Clean Energy Ministerial, gathering governments, private sector, and finance institutes to stimulate the demand for low-emission materials through public procurement. Responsible Steel is offering certification programs for steel, both on company and product level. And Steel Zero and First Movers are coalitions of companies using their purchasing power to create demand, create early markets for innovative technologies. But we also see initiatives or activities among the steel companies. There has been an increase in new steel brands where the steel producers market low CO2 emissions alongside with other properties. And this is fantastic with all these activities, but it also causes some confusion. Some of these initiatives have proposals for criteria of what is considered near zero emission steel or low emission steel. But the purpose might differ. The system boundaries might differ. For example, do we include only site emissions? Do we include emissions from upstream, emissions from energy and raw materials? Are we referring to a company, an intermediate product, a final product? How do we handle connections to other parts of the value chain? Different numbers are presented, criteria, but they're not always comparable. And talking about standards, there are standards, and mainly on how to measure, how to calculate emissions, and how to report them. But there is also, when it comes to standards, room for improvement to reach full comparability. So this is a jungle, and it's growing. And this is what we will have our panels to talk about today.
Thank you very much, Helene. Well, that slide with the logos is one that I use quite often as well, and it tends to, for every time I show it, there are a few additional logos on it, so it's definitely an area that keeps growing. All right, so that was the introductory session to the seminar, and we'll now move into the panel discussions with the first panel on why we need decarbonization standards for steel, and what are the challenges for making coherent standards. I welcome the panelists here, those who are here in person, to the tables here next to me. But let me start by introducing our panelists online. So first we have Stella Ivanova. She's a policy advisor at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And yeah, you can all see her, excellent. And then we have Maureen Hinman. She's the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, also online. With me here in the room, I have, let's see the order, Mattias Bergdahl. He's deputy head of Unit for Standards and Policy at DG GROW of the European Commission. I have Mark Delobel, he's head of fossil-free material purchasing at the Volvo Group. And last but not least, Göran Nyström, senior advisor at Ovako Group. So first of all, very welcome to all of you. I'm very happy for you to be here. Just to prepare the audience a little bit, we're going to do a round of questions and hopefully also engage some discussions among the panelists. But after that, I will open up the floor for questions from all of you here in the room, but also online. So please think about if there's something that you would like to ask our excellent panelists when that time comes. All right, so kick off. Let me start with you, Stella. And the German government is very engaged on this topic of definitions for near zero steel. That was very clear, for example, in last year's G7 presidency, but also as a very active partner in the industrial deep decarbonization initiative that we just heard of, about on public procurement. Could you tell us a little bit why common definitions are so important to you and what the policy goals for the government related to decarbonization of the steel sector?
Yeah, thank you everyone for having me and greetings from Berlin today. Happy to be here, and before I answer the questions, I just support the previous statements. It's just what we're also thinking about. Why we do need common definitions, and why we identified the need to actively support it during the G7 presidency. We identified the need for them in order to decarbonize our heavy industries, not only at national level, but also on European and international. They play a key role in our policy framework. We drafted the framework with the goal of climate neutrality by 2045 across all sectors, including the steel sector. But we cannot further continue in the different instruments before defining these, before defining what it is climate neutrality or near zero emission, to know what to support further down the road. So this clarity is important for the policy toolbox, for the policy frameworks, but it's also important for consumers in near future. It is important also for trade in order to know what we are buying and with what we are trading. There was the issues of comparability just mentioned that we're also looking for, and especially in the 2020s, we have also many steel plants that requires a reinvestment, and we want to give a clear signal to them where we go with this, where the path is. So this is also a crucial role where definitions are coming in, and we want to seize the opportunity to just go into that direction of climate neutrality, not only in the steel sector, but the steel sector as a blueprint for the others as well, starting with basic materials and going further in more complex products. So the old comes down. We cannot do it alone, and we cannot just release standards and definitions for Germany, but we need them on European and international level. And this is why I'm happy to be part of the conversations today and excited to hear as well the other panelists what they have to say about it. To IDDI, we wanted also to support the framework with a clear demand signal and support the new products with establishing clear pathways where they can market their products and make green materials a business case. So this is also a really important lever to us, where we see how we can proceed further, not only relying on subsidies, but also showing a way towards a new competitive green market.
All right, thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to many of these points throughout this afternoon. Let me now turn to Matthias. The European Commission is in the process of rolling out an extensive green policy agenda. This is, of course, based on the Green Deal as a broad framework, and of course, a goal to reach climate neutrality in 2050. It includes many different, policy instruments and various legislation. For example, the new one on eco-design. In this context, what do you think it takes to keep prosperity, growth, and competitiveness of the EU steel industry at the same time as we are pushing for this transition agenda? And of course, like Stella was saying, many steel companies are truly global players.
Thank you very much. Interesting question. I just start by continuing what Annika was discussing about the long pedigree of the organization. So I work for the European Commission. That started as the European coal and steel community 70 years ago. So that shows how important steel is and was back then. And that was the energy and steel to rebuild Europe again. And I think we're a bit similar transition now. We need to change everything. Now I just start by saying that we are from the Commission side, we're fully committed to support the transition for the steel industry, both making sure that we have the regulatory framework in place that's necessary, but also facilitating investments and the financing of this thing. Comment on it more in details. Yes, we have this, as you know, this Fit for 55 package there, and there's a number of phases so we can fulfill the climate targets. Many of them applies also to the steel sector, and for example, we talk about the carbon pricing setting. That's a clear signal that we need to work towards decarbonization. We have the CBAM, the carbon border management or adjustment mechanism. We also want, in that way, to create a level playing field within Europe, but also internationally. I think that's going to be discussed more in the second panel about the international aspect of this. I work in the unit that works on standards. I'm not an expert in steel standards, but we work on this. And I think Stella was already hinting on these things. You cannot look at this in isolation. We look at standards across this thing. We deal everything from lifts and protective equipment to steel standards, and it's linked in many ways. If you look at, for example, the discussion now about energy or the hydrogen, so there it's a way also we are working on the Commission to enable that there is an availability of cheap and sufficient supply of hydrogen, for example, which is one part of it. We need to make sure we have enough energy for these things. So it's not just what's happening in the steel sector, but we are looking much more horizontally in this way and try to fit this together. Of course, and I'm fully aware there's a room for improvement. I'm here actually more to listen than to speak, because I want to hear from you what you think is needed, what is necessary, and actually getting the expertise of you, because I'm not an expert in the steel sector. We work on standards, but how can we make the standardization system work in your favor also there? So it's actually, I'm going to be noting down a lot of interesting information for you today. And that's the main thing. And of course, we look also for financing and helping with this thing. We have the EU ETS Innovation Fund, where we can get money for this work. We have the Clean Steel Partnership. I think someone mentioned that already before. That's under Horizon Europe. We have the research money there. We have also this so-called climate, energy, and environmental aid guidelines, which means how can state aid help with because the state aid rules are quite strict, and when the government and the state can help step in. But in Europe, there are rules, exceptions for this, and this is a typical area that would, in my personal opinion, should be able to be exempted for helping this transition there. I'm not trying to see if there's anything else I would like to mention. There's a lot of these things, and I think actually being a Swede myself, I'm quite proud that Sweden has actually a prominent role in this playing, and I'm looking forward actually to see the meeting with the US also in the end of the month there, where the Americans will come and look at this. Hopefully, they have a chance also to see the Swedish plant in the north of Sweden.
Yeah, and I think that was great. I was going to ask you to what extent definitions and standards play a role, but I think you covered that quite well. And in terms of just the organization here, I mean, you panelists don't hesitate to raise your hands and kind of want to ask questions from the other panelists. I think it would be great if we could get a real discussion going. Okay, so let me now turn to Mark. So Volvo is, of course, a very important steel industry customers, and now the tailpipe emissions are expected to decrease drastically over the coming years. The focus, or how can I say, the emissions from the embodied carbon emissions in the materials that make up the vehicle, of course, becomes more important or becomes more prominent. So in this context, why is one or maybe several definitions of near zero steel or green steel, or as we heard before, important to you?
Yeah, thank you, Åsa. But maybe before I straight answer this question, maybe I want to put in perspective why steel is important for Volvo Group. So Volvo Group, we are a transport solution providers. We mean that we do machines like trucks, buses, or construction equipment. And what we need is to satisfy the needs of our customer. And our customer, it's simply they want zero emission operation. And to do that, that's why we have made a commitment that we will be a complete 100% fossil-free group company by 2040. That's the bold statement. Now, as it was said before, we cannot only look at our own scope and say, yes, we did it. We are looking at the entire supply chain, all the upstream part. And here, the raw materials, it's 80% of the emission of our upstream part. So we are talking about the mining emission, to the raw material making, to the finished part that then join our operation and that we assemble, for instance, on our truck. And if you look at this raw material, it's a big mix. There is a lot of material. So steel is a very important part, but there is other metals like aluminium and copper, plastics, rubber, a lot of things. And here what we are looking is that the weight of steel, it's 50 to 70% of the weight of material, but it's also the same range, 50 to 70%, depending on which product you're talking about, of carbon emission. So it's the major contributor for steel. So let's start from that. But it's not only steel. So you were talking about it was a jungle out there about a lot of things, but then we also have all the input from the other sectors. So for us, it's not that we need a near zero emission steel definition, it's that we need something that can be clarifying, that making sure that we all talk the same language, and that when we work with our supply chain partner, it's not one partner directly with a steelmaker. For instance, we have sometimes a lot of people in between. And for instance, to do one truck, we have thousands, if not 10,000 of parts, which is thousands of suppliers sometimes. So we cannot talk directly, each of them being the expert and just talk. That's why we need some kind of standard so that we are sure that we all talk the same language.
Let me follow up with this, because you are a member of the First Movers Coalition, which is, of course, we've heard about mentioned before, but an initiative for steel customers to make commitments related to their purchasing of near zero steel. Can you tell us a little bit what the reason is? Why did you join the First Movers Coalition, and how do you work to achieve the commitments that you made in that context?
Yeah, so First Mover Coalition, it's an initiative that was launched back at COP26 in Glasgow, which was in 2021. And at that time, we really need that, we see that we needed acceleration, speed in the transition, that everyone was saying, yes, we will do it. We commit to science-based target. By 2050, we'll be neutral, but it looks like all investment will be made in 20 years. And here we really wanted to have a short-term commitment. So, and we liked the approach of First Mover Coalition because it was already to put the private and public sectors together as a full ecosystem, having members from buyer like us, buyer of steel or of aluminium, putting demand together, so sending demand signals to the industry and putting together all the enablers like Finance Institute, governments, to make sure that all together we find solutions to make a real change. And here the First Mover Coalition is really about a transformation. So the objective is not to just improve few percent. It's really to have a different way of making steel innovation that will really break toward the near zero, which is at least a 90% decrease versus traditional way of making steel. And it was to make it by 2030, so which is tomorrow. So it's not 2050 or 2040. So that's what we liked a lot. And since 2 years, almost now, 1.5 years that we are in this ecosystem, then we learn a lot, we share. And today, what has been said so far, it's a lot of challenge that we see. So I'm glad to see that we have all the same view on what needs to be tackled. But it's one way. Of course, what we want is the decarbonization. It's not just to meet a certain criteria of a certain percentage of our purchase. It's really to bend the curve and go towards this zero emission.
Yeah, well, it's one of all these initiatives that we've heard about, of course, and an important one. All right, so let's move to Maureen. On the screen. So you're representing Silverado Policy Accelerator, and I don't believe that everyone here has heard about your organization before. So could you tell us a little bit about what it is, what you are, what you do, and how, of course, you engage and contribute to the discussions on a coherent view on steel standards?
Certainly, and thanks so much for having me here today, if not virtually. So I'm the chair and co-founder of Silverado Policy Accelerator, and one might ask, what is a policy accelerator? We're a bit of a think-do tank. We're based in Washington, D.C., and the concept is actually fairly simple. The idea is to accelerate novel policy solutions to pressing global challenges by investing in really high quality, deep policy ideas and implementation plans, and then in the U.S. funding the implementation of those ideas. So we work on the steel decarbonization aspects from a trade policy perspective. Silverado Policy Accelerator has 3 different areas we work in: national security, trade and industrial security. So we do a lot of work on critical supply chain for things like chips and clean energy products. And then we have a third pillar we call EcoSec, which is ecological and economic security. And that's really about assuring an economically viable transition. So between those 2 latter pillars, that's kind of where we find this sweet spot on decarbonization standards with the steel industry, because it is an energy intensive, highly traded industry. And because obviously steel is sort of the first bite of the apple governments are taking with regard to how we define what is carbon neutral and then how we choose to border adjust. And so we work very, very closely on issues related to carbon border adjustment. Just my big headline on that is that, we already speak the same language when it comes to trade. We have a harmonized tariff system. We know what is everything that we possibly want to push across the border, even illegal things. And so what we need in terms of steel decarbonization standards and steel carbon standards is really an analog that works effectively with the harmonized tariff system, so governments can make sure that they're measuring the same thing in the same way, and that most importantly, customs officers and other trading businesses can have with some business certainty on how those materials are going to be treated at the border, whether they are taxed through a CBAM or through some other mechanism.
Let me continue by asking, what do you, in terms of coordination, because we've seen this slide now with all these logos, and one of the logos is the WTO as well, of course. They've taken recently an interest, or I should say relatively recently, an interest in this. So how do you see, or what needs do you see for coordination between these different actors that are active in this space, and specifically on what issues and potentially methodologies as well?
I think there's a high demand for coordination. So just a couple things. I previously was a U.S. trade negotiator on trade and environment, and then prior to that on technical barriers to trade. I covered the environmental technologies industry for the U.S. Department of Commerce for many, many years prior to that. And so I have a kind of a sort of deep expertise on these particular issues. I think that there is there's a lot of reason for optimism around the question around standards. We really need them. From the United States perspective, I think we're in a good position because the U.S. government is already compelled to use international standards in any sort of regulatory schema that it comes up with, right? That is something that every regulatory agency knows they have to do. In terms of the matrix of standards development, I think that is extremely positive. But on the more troubling side, we have to have all of these organizations, including stakeholders from across the private sector, users, governments, and so on and so forth, in the same room, speaking the same language, because we don't have the same amount of time to develop common steel standards for traded goods as we did for the development of the harmonized tariff system. I am really heartened by these lofty goals about decarbonization by 2040 or 2035, but it's very hard to do that if we're not measuring, and we're not measuring equally, because that will create the opportunity for cross-border arbitrage, which I think ultimately will defeat our objectives. And then the other thing is that we need to get these done quickly, and we need to get them in place quickly, because if we do this right, these policies are actually meant to be terminal. They're supposed to go away because we're supposed to hit net zero.
That's a really good point. Where it's urgent, but it's also let's say somewhat a short-term solution, hopefully, as we move through the transition. Let me turn to you, Göran, as our industry representative on this panel. So the steel industry, we've heard it now mentioned a few times, is really a truly global industry. And though people who are not so familiar with our industry tend to talk about steel as one thing, they don't necessarily mention that there are different ways of making steel, or that there are lots of different qualities and product types. And in reality, of course, companies are very different, and they operate under different circumstances as well. In your view, what needs are there in the steel industry to report emissions, but also fulfill customer requirements, and at the same time avoid greenwashing?
Thank you, Åsa. That's an excellent question. I have Volvo next to me, so. Ovako, we belong to Nippon Steel. We're a Japanese company now. I think we picked up some of the Japanese traits. At Ovako, as a part of Nippon Steel, we have a leading low carbon footprint, leading high circularity, and also a leading high ambitions. Still, we have not put any label or brand or etiquette on our products in regards to carbon emissions and so on. So I'm happy to say that we have not contributed to the 40 labels that you saw, but instead we want to see this as the engineering company we are. We want to see it as a property, a physical property that can be measured independently and reach the same results. And I think this is the key topic here. Standardization, if you take tensile strength of a steel, a very basic property, we don't standardize what is called a high strength steel. That's not what we standardize. We standardize the measurement. We standardize how we do tensile strength testing. And we have verification of the instruments, we have certification of the results. And then maybe, yes, in some applications, there are set sort of levels of strength performance, but we don't run around and put a label on our product and say, this is a high strength steel, and everybody should use the same definition, a high strength steel. That's not what we should do. We should not have green steel labeling. We should standardize the measurements in regards to the scope of measurements all the way from the cradle to the gate. We should know how we measure, we should have it verified. And then let supply and demand play its game. And I promise you this will be much faster than any stately or over-stately intervention. That's how simple I see it.
Yeah, I wish it was that simple, sort of. I mean, I wish there was one answer. I do think there are still different views on this, but it's
But we're united with, for instance, BASF has the same approach, exactly the same. They are also a basic provider of products that end up with Volvo. And if we do what we and BASF propose, then Mark, he can summarize the contributions into his transport solution, and then he gets the measurements he needs.
Yeah. How do you engage? I mean, practically in these discussions? Obviously, by being part of the seminar, for example. But are there any other ways? Are you, for example, active in standardization work?
So yes, of course. First of all, we are a member of Jernkontoret and Eurofair and World Steel, so we're supporting that. Not always agreeing, I must say, but I think also we, in the position we have, we act as a bit of a watchdog. So we are letting our voice be heard when we see things that are about to go wrong. And one of the things that are about to go wrong is this so-called sliding scale, where you introduce a negative factor for a greener steel. The more circular, the less carbon-emitting a steel is, you introduce a negative factor. And it sounds quite strange. And it is strange also from a legality perspective. In public purchasing laws, this is completely illegal. It's discriminatory and goes against the basic tenets of public purchasing. So I think we are happy to see also the negative sides of what's going on. And we're raising the voice to counter that.
Okay, that's excellent. I mean, it's great. I wish everyone was as engaged as you are in this. Coming back to what you were saying a little bit before, let me open that question to Stella and Maureen perhaps first. This idea of having common measurement methodologies and standards, sort of before we get to the, well, not necessarily before, but when we can talk about the definitions, there are different views on what they should look like or whether we need them or not. But I think what we can all agree on is that we need to measure and report on the same things, or the basis need to be the same. So I've seen you nodding a little bit when the others have been speaking. So I was wondering if you wanted to comment on this. Maybe Stella, you could start.
Yeah, I've been knowing we indeed need to measure and report the same things. That's just the basic. We had many discussions on national level, how we can do it and how we cannot shut ourselves out of the world by doing so. So we're trying hard. I would just say, according to we're including everyone, international standard organization, every relevant organization and body that have to say something on product carbon footprint or decarbonizing heavy industries, etc. We all saw the slides. I won't go into the details, but we have a very inclusive process on this with the national industry. But we are looking, on contrary to the statement just now, we are looking at definitions and label that will help us to guide through this jungle of claims, I will say. The European Union is also planning something about the green claims. We have to navigate in the market just to see what it is actually really approved or could be labeled as near zero for the end consumer. It's important. It's not about to have a standard on the label or on the definition. It's about just to also go against some greenwashing or some claims that are not deserving. So on the label, we're looking at this as a good opportunity for the end consumer, for the downstream supply chain, that they can say, okay, here I can base my purchase decision on this one. It's also great for policy, so I will make a case for the labeling, but agree that measurement and reporting should be agreed, and definitely. We don't need there to try to standardize some definitions, but we have to make it visible what it is climate friendly and what not for the end consumer. Yeah, so that will be on this part from my side. Thank you.
Maureen, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I do take a little bit of a different approach. I do really think that much of this should be the focus of governments. for a couple of reasons. Regulators already, report, collect, and have requirements for reporting emissions. Even though carbon and other greenhouse gases may not always be the objective pollutant, you generally have those numbers anyways. And in most, heavy industry and productive processes, the industries we care about, it's really three big things, cradle to grate. It's, extraction emissions, power emissions, and non-power emissions, right? Which is usually the chemical reactions. And so, government has that data, and governments should be spending a lot of time coordinating and figuring out how they're measuring and how we can use the existing data reservoir to come up with comparable, fair, and reasonable numbers that can also protect the proprietary privacy of companies. Now, again, a different tack on the question of green labels. Anyone who's been following the WTO over the past years, 20 or 30 years, on these matters, knows how rancorous the green label sort of discussions have been. Personally, I think that there's a big difference between something that's fit for purpose for marketing purposes and something that's fit for purpose for regulatory purposes, with the view towards the regulatory measurements tend to be more rigorous, and they also tend to be more reliable and more trustworthy. And so my sense is that really, there's a strong role also for all stakeholders, and in particular governments. I don't care what you do with that data, if you want to slap a green label on something, but I do want there to be some fairness between what the consumer getting what they're paying for in terms of carbon neutrality.
Let me continue with that question, passing on to Mark. So you were talking about, of course, a truck, for example, is made of many, many different materials. And that's something from the steel industry that we're also discussing quite often. We are, of course, competing with many other materials for various applications. And sort of what's your view on there to be not just measurement standards for steel, but for all of them, and how these should be sort of interoperable?
Yeah, but here I think I will agree that the most important is the measurement itself, because in every initiative, I'm happy to see 40 labels. That means people are working on the topic, so it's better than having nothing, right? But then of course, it has to be comparable. And what is comparable and what is the objective of all this initiative is decarbonization, right? I have not heard anything else. So it's the CO2. If we shortcut, it's more easy to say CO2 reduction. So for me, the only way objective for us is to have a standard to how you measure the CO2. So make sure that we make decisions when we select our suppliers, knowing what is the CO2 footprint. And we'll make a business case. And after, of course, initiative like carbon pricing and all those things can help to accelerate even more, convince even more people to use those solutions. But it's the only objective we are serving here. So after the label that will say if you are below a certain level, then you're, class A, while if you're above, you're class B, I have a hard time to see how we will have a value for our customer here, because of course we mix with other material also. Maybe someone that only buys steel and work on steel, maybe it's a bit different, but for us it's a mix. So for us, we really need to make sure we count the right thing.
Can I ask maybe Matthias, I don't know if you have any comments on this, because obviously, I mean, as a regulator, you have all the different sectors and materials in there. And
it's true, and if you add aspects like sustainable mining into this, you're into a totally different discussion point. Was it impact the environment and the people working in the mines, what kind of conditions they're working on? So it becomes very complex, and that's where you have which is being worked on now, this sustainable reporting standards and things like this, which makes for companies like you even more complicated, because you need to have the whole supply chain, and not just for the CO2, but for everything else. So unfortunately, that's the way we're working to it, and I guess there's going to be the subcontractors and the ones below you're going to be suffering from this also. So I think that's a challenge. That's outside my domains, but I'm fully aware of this, and we sometimes get questions about this coming also there. So no, I think so, and especially if you talk about if you look at public procurement and things like that, what do you put there how do you put the thresholds, what do you put the conditions in the public procurement? Do you reference a number or a standard or things like this? So we're fully aware of that, but I think from the Commission side, we want to support the supply and the demand side of it, and try to get this working. And ideally, as already been mentioned, part of this is done by the industry, but where it's necessary, like you mentioned from the US side, the government might need to step in sometimes, or at least nudging in the right direction and making sure that we have a framework in place that enables this to work. But standards in general, it's industry driven. We're not writing the standards, the Commission side. We're involved in it, we stimulate it, and we urge. But that's why it's interesting also to hear from industry what's needed and what's not working, what's working. So.
Let me sort of follow up on that with a question to Göran in particular. So we know that there are thousands and thousands of steel grades and different qualities. And as a steel industry, we very often talk about the right steel in the right place. Because of course it can bring the most value in that point, and that's important from a functionality point of view, obviously, resource efficiency, but also in terms of decarbonization. If you would like to comment on that, and also how, because that makes it also difficult in standards, right, or in definitions. Because again, in general, people talk about steel, but we who are deeply involved in the industry, we know that steel is not steel as such, and somehow we need to get this reflected in these discussions and the definitions and data and so on.
Yeah, and I think there are three aspects of sustainability that is not easily collapsed into one measure or one way of discussing. I mean, one is the carbon footprint. Another one is the circularity aspects of the product. But the third one is, of course, the product performance in actual use. And typically we find that if you apply a better steel, a stronger steel, a longer lasting steel, or whatever it is, the climate savings are far bigger than anything in the making of that steel. So of course, that becomes the first priority. And yes, we have all these different variants, so it's not always that easy to compare, but in purchasing at Volvo, you know how to buy a good steel from a bad steel. So you can separate into groups based on your how you qualify the steels. And as one example, in the Volvo headquarters, you have this big IPS drive engine from Volvo Penta with this proud claim that it saves 30% of fuel. And the reason it does that, maybe you don't even know, is actually that it's Ovako steel inside. Normally we're not allowed to talk about, what makes it. I mean, Sweden has a long tradition of having the best trucks, the best rock drilling equipment, the best bearings, and we happen to be behind a lot of these things. But this in particular is our so-called IQ steel that was applied successfully by Volvo, and they solved a technical issue and saving 30% fuel in operation. So it's just one example there, but you're absolutely right. And I think it's not easy to marry footprint with performance. So you need to sort of have a separate first view performance. What performance level are you at? And then you can discuss footprint.
I don't know if anyone else from the panel would like to comment on that.
Maybe I just
please.
Yeah, I just want to add that I fully think our approach is not only to focus on decarbonization of the way, what's the process to produce raw materials. It's really, actually, yes, the first is to not use. So it's to reduce. That's the first thing. So innovation, higher grade of steel, tensile, and so on, all what can be first, then we will eliminate 100% of that kilo that we don't use, right? And then in the circularity it's a key also for us to. So when we say the scrap, the recycled content, it's of course better to reuse than produce new. But then ultimately, because you saw the curve of the needs, and it will continue like this, then we have to have new. But then green new, zero emission is the target. But it's really this three step that we approach. Yeah.
All right. I think we'll stop there and see if there are any questions. There are any questions in the room? And I think Cecilia's keeping an eye online. Is there something? All right. So there is a microphone. Wait, a microphone coming to you.
My name is Pelle Molin, and I was for a number of years the CEO of a Swedish company called Avesta Sheffield. My question is very simple and very difficult. You have mentioned Maureen, and you have mentioned also Matthias, something very important, government. My simple question is, how, when it comes to standardization, do we know that the government of China will act in standardization? because China is releasing half of all the CO2 going out into the air. If we shall have a standardization which works, we need to include China. And the word China has not been mentioned so far in this discussion. I would very much appreciate to have a short comment from someone. Thank you.
Okay, Maureen is waving her hand. So we start with you, Maureen.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in on that. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why relying on the reservoir regulatory data for coming up with those quantification standards is really valuable, because it gives regulators the ability to impute and also to extrapolate and model around what other countries are doing within a pretty close margin of accuracy. So my sense on China is that we don't wait for China to lead. The US and the EU and other like-minded countries lead on the quantification question. We do the modeling for countries like China. And if they don't like it, then they can supplement with their own data, right? That's verifiable. One thing I do love about air pollution control methodologies is that even if you're lying at the site, you still have fence line monitors and regional air quality monitors that will tell you if somebody's fooling around and they're not playing fair. And then the other reason why I think this is really important to draw on this data reservoir is that we still have to worry on this issue about developing countries and their capacity to quantify. They cannot be left behind in this. We need a whole world solution, and certainly having data models that provide the ability to plug and play with vaster reservoirs of sort of known data, whether it be trade data or industrial production data or, regional monitoring data, will certainly get us to that solution we need to get to very, very, very quickly, right?
Anyone else would like to? Yeah, Matthias, would you like to say something?
I can just concur with what was said, but also the China, at least the European way of working, we know they're there. We are actually having a regular dialogue on standards with China, once a year more or less. So we discuss it. Doesn't mean we agree on everything, but at least they inform us what they're doing, and we inform them what we are doing. And surprisingly, a lot of areas, they actually agree with us. It doesn't mean that the Communist Party will give the blessing, but actually, on the least we discuss on this level. So it could be the areas we don't discuss with them, and we have not, at least when I've been with them, discussed steel standards, green steels, but on other areas, it's interesting to know what they're doing, and actually they're very transparent with what they're doing for standard making. And they are pushing, and I think this is one, but that's probably for the second panel, this how we can internationally work with this and work with ISO, because there are 5,000 Chinese standardization experts every year coming on the market. So they're already flooding, but they will be flooding even more the standardization work. And that's actually from us, from the Commission side, we're worried, because you need you in industry, we need other people to go there to the standardization and make sure that our interests are also covered by these things. But that's for the second session, I think. But then we have a very close, as we said already before, the TTC, we closely work with the US. We are concretely working. We have not discussed steel and low carbon steel yet, but we are discussing other areas with the US, and actually we have quite a fruitful discussion. And I think the US is doing the same with other key partners around the world. So this is a way to work it. But yes, China is very much on the table. And I think we have a choice. Do we want to have EU, US driven standards making, or do you want to have Chinese, Indian driven standard making? Yeah. And that's a choice we have. And actually that we cannot do. We can stimulate it, we can say, but we are not the Commission going to these meetings. It's industry and the member states.
Maybe I can just make a small comment from my own perspective. So in the World Steel Association, we have Chinese members, of course, and they are very actively participating in our life cycle assessment data collection, for example. They also developed and released recently their own EPD, so Environmental Product Declaration rules for steel in China. So there is work going on there as well. Let's see if there is another question. Yeah, Bonnie, please go. Yep.
There are some political complexities there, but again, standardizing, if you see it as a physical property, how you measure it, that's global. You can do that globally. You can set the standard for measuring tensile strength, equipment verification, and so on. So I think we should start there.
Yeah.
Scope and the measurement.
I agree. That's much less controversial than setting limits and thresholds. Stella, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I would like to add to the discussion on data. Just to make it clear, government does not have this reservoir that we need. Yes, we have data, but not on the need places and not the right scope of emissions. It's not the whole picture. The data that we need, especially in the public procurement part of the government, that's a little bit difficult and really tricky in the in the applied areas, for example, construction sector, etc. We are talking here about project and product design. We have to include much more steps, as is being told, about performance, etc. We have to look at the whole life cycle, and so we are not only talking about CO2 emissions, but also so many other things. So it makes it all really complex. So I just wanted to highlight also the efforts of the Japanese colleague during the G7 presidency on this topic as well, because they also identified the need. And there is a proposal from the IEA and as well from the OECD in this matter. So it has been a step forward in the direction towards common grounds and on definitions and standards. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll hear a little bit more about that in our second panel. Any more questions? Yeah, Helen?
Yes. No, it's actually a question to Stella, because since Germany is so active, what is actually the time plan for Germany when it comes to public procurement and demands for that, or criteria and other things close to this, climate clubs or whatever?
Yeah, so basically, thank you. Basically, the whole package. We have currently ongoing two processes. We have the consultation on the green procurement pledge from IDDI, especially for the construction sector. In the pledge, there is a comprehensive proposal for how can we implement the definitions proposed by the IEA last year during our G7 presidency. But we have to elaborate them and to make them operable, to make them work in our national context, in our national procurement framework. We have also a really good assessment framework for sustainability in buildings, so we have to combine them too. So it's not always on the supply side something like a standard or measurement, but also on the demand side that we have to combine. We have a national consultation process on the definition and possible instruments that could support the industry on the way to decarbonize, with the focus on steel, cement, and also chemistry. And we planned by the end of the summer to bring out our concept, how we can define what it is near zero emission and how we can support it with policy instruments. That will be by the end of summer to the timeline. The pledge, the consultation is due to the end of the year, so we can say how we can translate it into our framework, our national framework. And around the Climate Club, I believe on the 4th of May was the first meeting of the task force. So this is also getting the work. Work is beginning, and we're excited to see how it goes further with memberships and topics. The main focus is there also to gather many governments to agree on common definitions and standards, especially in the second area, to facilitate further the decarbonization of the industry. Yeah, so but there's no timelines that I can tell you today.
All right. I'm looking around to see if there are any more questions. Come on now. We've heard lots of different aspects being raised here. Is there anything, Cecilia, online? No? For later, okay. Yeah, that's true. Some of the topics that were raised now towards the end, we'll come back to a little bit in the second panel, more about the international collaboration and also the G7 report. Okay, well, let's finish this panel with just a round of comments from you all. What is the main thing that you would like to, well, either that you take away from this discussion, or that you would like the audience to take away from the discussion? So let's just start from Matthias and then Göran and Mark, and then we come online.
No, it's been very useful. For me, it's important that I will bring the message back. I'm here, we're saying, I think the important thing is, as we've just mentioned now, that we need to take the lead in the standard setting of the measurements and things like this. So we actually set a precedence also, because in many ways we've been leading before in other areas. So let's together with our friends in the US, partners in the US side, and maybe other countries around the world, setting a standard there, and not letting other countries decide our standards the way forward. I think that's the most important thing. Also, you mentioned China, but that's nothing to take away from here. But there was an anecdote the other day. I spoke to a company. Yeah, but you know, they have real-time measurement. So if you have a plant in China, they have the water, the exhaust water that coming out of the plant, the exhaust from the pipes. The government have, maybe in some sectors only, they're measuring in real time, which is a level we don't do. And they can tell the plants, yes, you have 30 days, you need to lower this. And if they don't do it, they get them fined or shut down the plants. And that's a level of this policy. We don't have it. Luckily, we don't have it in the EU, but also China, it doesn't mean that they will not do environmental. When they do something very drastically, maybe even faster than us in some ways. So I don't think we should automatically put China equals polluting by definition. But of course, we need to have an equal trading with them, so as a trading partner.
Yeah. Göran, there?
Yeah, I'm sure senior representative like Pelle Molin would agree. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The old statement. And let's start there. Treat it fact-based, great engineering data. Let's work on that. That's what we need, and then let supply-demand play its game. In Sweden, we have since 25 years environmental product data declarations. There are different ways of doing this and securing that it's done fairly. And for people who lie, well, we should ensure that this is punished. I think also in regards to product performance, we need to understand that this IPS drive was not created by staying by standards. The best products in the world are done by going beyond standards. That we see from all our customers. The best products are created by going beyond standards. So let's remember that. Standards represents a minimum level. We can do much more. And Ovako, for our side, we're also happy to support this American initiative called Global Steel Climate Council, which has no issues with the legality of what is being proposed. There we can see a better benchmark between companies. So I think we have avenues to walk, and let's do it together.
Okay, great. Mark?
One key takeaway I have today, that you all said that you will make my life easier. That's all what you said. I took note, and I think I have a lot of people heard that. So meaning by having a easier way to compare and to make sure we don't need to dig into all the detail to check, but did you forget something? Or, you know, because that's what we do today, and we do it on our big tickets. But when you want to scale up, you cannot do that. So that's one key takeaway. After question about timing, it's for me of key importance, because we should not forget why we are doing all that. I mean, it's we know that the climate change will not wait, that we need to act now to have the effect and limit the effect of the global warming by 2040 and 2050, Paris Agreement. And so we should make sure that this year, 2023, we take the right decision and we not hold on due to financial aspect, because we waiting how we will finance all that, because maybe there is not the right governmental support or the right punishment, if I take your word, for the not doing it, and then we just wait and delay. So I think it's here we need to speed. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Let's go to Maureen, and then Stella, you get the final word.
Thank you. Well, continuous emissions monitoring technologies exist and are widespread. So we have a lot of the data, maybe not all of it, if we're worried about sort of end of life and life cycle issues. But let's measure the physical properties of GHG around these products. Let's measure the same things, so we're all speaking the same language as we work together to decarbonize.
Great. Stella?
Yeah, thanks. I will make it just quick. Yeah, I agree. It has to be something that is doable, that is workable, but I don't believe that we have to focus on easy, but we have to focus on ambition and how I can secure ambition transformative solutions for both routes, as well as the primary and the secondary. So the definition will be oriented toward this, how we, with ambition goals and ambition tools, we can support the climate neutrality goal. So that will be my last contribution for today. Thank you.
All right. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists. I would in particular thank Stella and Maureen online, because I know this is not easy. It's actually much easier to be in person than online. So this concludes the session before the coffee break. So we're going to break for coffee now for about 20 minutes. And for those of you here in the room, we'll be back. Well, everyone will be back 10 to 4, but though you might be in different time zones, obviously. So see you then for the second panel. Please take your seats. All right, welcome back after the coffee break. I hope those of you online also had a chance to stretch your legs and get something to drink. We are now halfway through the program, roughly, and we are going to start with our second panel for today. So this panel is of course based on what we talked about before, but also looking how do we go, looking forward, sort of where do we go from here? Who is able to take this forward? How can we get a greater coherence on the decarbonization of steel, and in particular the standards aspects of that? So we have an excellent panel also this time, of course. This time we have 4 panelists online and 2 here in the room. We have online Dennis Messina. He's a desk officer for the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda at the US Department of Energy. Then we have Fiona Skinner. She's an international expert and coordinator for the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative at UNIDO. We also have Angelo Torrente. He's a policy officer, US and Canada Department, DG Trade at the European Commission. And then we have Will Hall. He's a clean energy technology analyst at the International Energy Agency. And then here in the room, I have with me Jonas Larsson. He's the Director Environmental Affairs at SSAB. And also Ulrika Franke, she's the President of the International Organization For Standardization. So first of all, welcome to all of our panelists. As we said before, don't hesitate to kind of give me a sign if you want to jump in or comment on what someone else has said, or just raise your hand online and wave a little bit so that I don't miss you. We're going to start with like before, with a round of questions for everyone. And let me start first with Dennis. So the world has been watching, of course, the US adopting the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's been talked about as a new era regarding US industrial policy and green transition. Could you tell us what this means in practice for the US government and the DOE, and how it relates to coherence on near zero steel definitions and standards?
Thank you for the opportunity to have this important conversation. I think the historic investments made by the administration over the last 12 months are going to take a lot of work to implement. I don't think that's a secret. I think in terms of like coherence, we're going to rely on engagement, multilateral engagement, to understand what the different perspectives are and how we operationalize the billions of dollars that the IRA, and I would add also the bipartisan infrastructure law are putting into this space. I think the last I checked, combined, we're investing $6.3 billion to address specifically industrial decarbonization. We have created an Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations to begin the process of developing projects demonstration projects that we can scale in partnership with the private sector. But it's going to take time. And I think maybe a useful resource to understand our perspective, in last September, we actually published an industrial decarbonization roadmap. And I would encourage, if you haven't seen it, to take a look at that. Our focus in terms of the investments that we're making, as they laid out in the roadmap, are specifically on energy efficiency, electrification, scaling up low carbon fuels and feedstocks, and then carbon capture, utilization and storage. So I think those are the focus areas that we have in terms of how we are going to move forward on standards. I think we have to, our Secretary of Energy is fond of saying we have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time. Our focus at the Department of Energy is to scale and deploy clean energy technologies quickly. That's our mandate from the Congress. That's our mandate from the administration, is to move forward with that. So at the same time, I think we need to have a broader dialogue on what standards are going to look like, but we can't wait for an outcome there. So we're going to keep moving with the data that we have. And if there are opportunities to get new data, to form new standards, I think there are plenty of multilateral platforms where we can talk through developing those standards, bringing them to maturity, and bringing them to a place that they're informative both for the industry and for policymakers.
Yeah, you have a lot going on, I believe, right now. To follow up on that, we had a question before on China. But China, of course, is not the only region in the world that is important from a steel perspective. We're expecting a great sort of increase in the production in India, for example. And considering the global nature of the steel industry, how do you work with other countries to speed up the transition?
I think it's important, as I said, to maintain a dialogue where it's possible, but we have to balance that against our objectives for 2030 and 2050. That's our first priority, is to ensure that we're deploying clean energy at the rate that is required to meet the administration's decarbonization objectives. Engaging with China, I think, is important, but again, our first priority is the policy objectives of the administration as it relates to 2030 and 2050. So I don't know that we're necessarily on the same page with China or India in terms of the timing. That's the reason why dialogues like the G20 are important to help advance that. But like I said, we have to be able to do two things at once. We need to engage in that dialogue, make progress, but at the same time, bring decarbonized industry at the speed where we can, where it's possible.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to Fiona. So you are the coordinator for IDDI, or the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, and it's one of the high-profile initiatives that are working to accelerate the steel industry transition. I should say steel, cement, and concrete, because it's not only related to steel. Could you tell us a little bit more about the goals of the IDDI, why definitions are important in this context, and how you concretely work to move forward?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the opportunity to join this conversation as well. So maybe just taking a brief step back as well. Here at UNIDO, we have the mandate of promoting and accelerating sustainable industrial development. And we do that through four main functions. So that's technology, technical cooperation, research and policy advisory, standards-related services, and finally, fostering partnerships and technology transfer. So part of that is hosting the Secretariat for the Clean Energy Ministerial's Industrial Decarbonization Initiative, or IDDI. And the work we do under the umbrella of this initiative touches to some extent on all four of those functions. So really our goal is to create thriving markets and spur demand for low and near zero emissions industrial products. So starting with steel, but also cement and concrete, as you mentioned. So within that goal, we really look at a few supporting elements. And a central element of that is green public procurement policy. So that's really with a view to creating that demand for the private sector to invest in the clean energy technologies, such as green hydrogen or CCUS and others, that will drive the deep decarbonization of heavy emitting sectors. So we consider public procurement to be a really, really powerful tool because it accounts for a huge portion of the steel that's procured globally. So our estimate is that in the countries signed up to the IDDI, public consumption of steel accounts for roughly 25% of the market. So using government purchasing power to switch to low and near zero emissions steel would send really vital signals to encourage those levels of investment and innovation required to create a thriving market. So essentially, if we see more governments committing to purchasing these products, that's really a huge signal for the private sector to bring in the investment that's needed. And to create that demand pull and leverage political will, we created a green public procurement pledge. So the pledge is open to national and subnational signatories who can choose the levels of the pledge that they are able to commit to. It's structured among 4 levels, so they build upon each other, and essentially levels 1 and 2 relate to the need for disclosure of the embodied carbon in these products, so through an EPD or another third-party verified digital format by 2025, and a requirement to conduct whole project lifecycle assessments and the need to achieve net zero in all public construction projects by 2050. And then the levels 3 and 4 are actual procurement commitments from governments. So requiring by 2030 the procurement of low emission steel, also cement and concrete, in public construction projects, applying the highest ambition possible under national circumstances. And then level 3 is about broad-based incentivization of existing technologies to reduce emissions in steel and cement, whereas level 4 actually asks governments to commit to procuring near zero emission steel and cement for signature construction projects. So that's really about incentivizing innovation and breakthrough technologies required to achieve the deep decarbonization of these sectors. So in September 2022, 3 governments actually committed to holding national consultations on this pledge. Those were the UK, Canada, and Germany. That's something that Stella referenced in the first panel as well. And they now have 1 year to decide on the level of ambition that they're able to commit to, and then they will move to implementation of these commitments. And then to bring this conversation back to the conversation on standards, we really need a solid foundation and an enabling environment for these markets. So part of what is needed is a common understanding of the definitions, the accepted emissions thresholds, GHG measurement standards, the data collection frameworks existing. And given that this is a globally traded product, working towards alignment and interoperability wherever it's possible. You know, especially if we look at this through the lens of buyers, there needs to be a clear and consistent definition of what is accepted as clean or green steel, and then measurement and verification frameworks to underpin those standards and to demonstrate compliance, so that, you know, buyers can understand what they are buying and are able to compare products in a way that is practical to them as well. So to support the Green Public Procurement Pledge, we're currently working towards guidance on harmonized product category rules for steel, but also cement and concrete. And greater alignment across product category rules will ensure that products are assessed using consistent methodologies, consistent system boundaries, data requirements, etc. And this in turn will offer common language and understanding to all of the stakeholders in the market to allow for transparent benchmarking and meaningful comparison across products through environmental product declarations, EPDs. And that's what we're asking for in the Green Public Procurement Pledge. So that's our goal. We're looking to bring in the demand, but also through that, the disclosure to make the market more transparent.
Yeah, that's a lot on your plate as well, I would say. I think everyone who's taking part in this discussion is extremely busy. Let me now turn to Angelo and the transatlantic relationship. I would say it's going through sort of a revival. And though a lot of focus is on trade policy, it also covers many other areas. The EU and US work together on decarbonization and related definitions. For example, there is the work of the Trade and Technology Council and the ongoing discussions to come to a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium. How do you think this can contribute to the work, or what's your view that this can bring?
Thank you. It was a pleasure to attend virtually this panel. It has been really a very rich in discussion already during the first panel, and I hope equally during the second panel. So, as we've seen, there are previous panels have already identified the various challenges. I work at the European Commission, and I work in DG Trade, which is the trade policy arm of the European Commission, and we're really focused on how we could advance at in bilateral and global level. And a bilateral level with the US, the transatlantic leg is really important for us. We have launched in 2021 the Technology Council, as it has been mentioned before. The fourth ministerial meeting will take place in Luleå at the end of the month. So this has already been a place where we have had discussion with the US on through one of the working group. There's a working group on climate clean tech where we have discussed whether there is possibility to harmonize standard at the bilateral level initially, and then to multilateralize. Then in parallel, there is the Global Sustainable Arrangement of Steel and Aluminium, also launched in 2021. Recently, both the EU and the US committed to conclude the negotiation by October 2023. So it is literally crunch time. And if I take a step back, the Global Sustainable Arrangement has multiple objectives. One goal is to find a permanent solution to the US Section 232 measures, but it also aims to drive innovation, contribute to the decarbonization of the steel and aluminum sectors, because also the aluminum sector is part of the conversation for the GSA. And the Global Sustainable Arrangement will be done in compliance with international obligations such as WTO rules and our domestic climate policies. As we speak, we've been having several conversations with the US administration. I can tell you that it has been, it is challenging. We continue to discuss because one element is whether we can assess whether there is a room for a uniform methodology. Sorry, 1 second. Or a comparable methodology. So these are elements which we are discussing, and I'm a bit on listening mode also from the previous and following panelists, whether there are bright ideas, because I'm always it's a really topical moment at this time. I think we owe certainty to the stakeholders, and this is a very challenging topic. But I think that we can work on this with the US, and then at global level, the GSA, the Global Sustainable Arrangement, will be open to third countries which will subscribe to their strong decarbonization commitments. So this is we do aim for an inclusive nature, provided they subscribe to strong commitments. So a lot of areas to discuss.
Yeah, let me just follow up on what you said there about sort of other countries getting into the discussion, because of course the discussions between the EU and the US is let's say a bilateral discussion, but there are many other fora, for example the G7 and the discussions around the Climate Club, the Breakthrough Agenda, or the G20, where governments also engage on these topics. So how do you, what is your view on those, or how can these complement each other? or will the TTC be enough, you think?
No, I think you raise a very important point, because for me, it's, the first slide, one of the first slides was shown at the beginning of this seminar, was showing all the various. It's a jungle. It keeps growing. What as Ellen said, so that is really something which is very much on the top of our mind. I think we will continue to ensure coherence with international initiatives such as G7, and so that is something that we will continue to work on, and because it will be important.
All right. Since we're talking about G7, that's an easy sort of how can I say to move to Will and to ask you about IEA's newly issued report on emission measurement and data collection for a net zero steel industry. This was, of course, a report that was asked for by the current Japanese G7 presidency. And in this report, you describe the need to standardize measurement methodologies and methods and to collect data. In the report, you also suggest principles and make recommendations for the G7. How do you see this work going forward? Or if you want.
Great, no, thanks, Åsa, and yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to speak. And it's been great listening to the first panel, and yeah, really excited for the conversation in the second panel as well. So you're very right. In our latest G7 report, which was published a couple of months back, we kind of recommended 3 tracks of work, or 3 separate tracks of emission measurement methodologies that countries and companies should follow to reform, review, and update those emission measurement methodologies in line with the requirements of a net zero steel sector. And I think the initial reaction that a lot of people had was, why 3? Why can't you just give us 1? Why can't you make it easier instead of harder? So I think why we did choose 3, and those 3 are ISO, they're World Steel. We work very closely with Åsa and her colleagues, and there's also Responsible Steel. So these are the 3 kind of organizations, initiatives who we highlighted as really important different stakeholder groups within the steel standardization space. So, ISO, as everyone knows, represents government and national level standard setting groups. World Steel, the wider steel industry, and then, in particular, the global steel industry. So it's great that World Steel has members from China, India, the US, Europe, etc. And then Responsible Steel, we really wanted to highlight as a more ambitious kind of subset of industry and civil society and academia. So Responsible Steel isn't just private sector, it's also civil society and academia, which we felt it was really important that they were also included within the conversation. So really it's about the need for being inclusive, making sure that we have the largest possible tent when talking to these different stakeholder groups, because we know in the future, as now, it's going to be really, really difficult to get every end user along the entire steel supply chain using exactly the same kind of standard. And the key the key word that we used within the report, which speaks very much to Angelo's point before me, is interoperable. So whilst these standards might be, these emission measurement methodologies might be slightly different in terms of who they're serving, we're really hoping that through the process that will follow with the Japanese government, that we can work towards making these different standard groups interoperable, so that different users, different consumers, different government policymakers can understand how they translate to one another, even if they're not exactly the same standard. So that's a really, really important point. And just to say that there's kind of the second reason why I guess we use this multi-track kind of approach, and it's to your point also about how we take it forward, is we really need to move fast on this, and I think everyone's aware of the pace we need to move. And the idea is that progressing this work in different fora can lower the risk of delay. If a single organization or initiative is for whatever reason unable to refine their methodology in time or quick enough, I think what we would encourage is a healthier, more varied dialogue across a wider set of stakeholders who can progress things on different fronts, but still aligned with a similar set of principles. And just to say, at the IEA, we're, it's not writing the report and then that's our work done. We very much kind of see ourselves continuing to participate and support, particularly our own members within the implementation and adoption of these methodologies. And just to give a shout out to our recently launched working party for industrial decarbonisation, which is kind of a technical official level group for some of our member countries to progress some of the work on standards and definitions beyond the G7, and really kind of taking that to a group of countries that are much, much wider. And I just want to kind of reiterate that one point, and it's been really, really helpful for us, and I think for others, that some of this work can start within the G7 context. But I think as conversation here today has shown, that's really not going to be enough. And we're really going to be focusing our efforts now, either through our own working party or by working very, very closely with the others on the call, like IDDI, as well as supporting other kind of financial and technical assistance work as well, like the Climate Investment Fund's industry work. But basically to offer this cohesive technical assistance offer for developing countries who, at the end of the day, are going to be the bulk of steel production in the coming decades. So it's really, really important that they're brought on board early and they feel like they have the capacity and the capability to implement some of the systems and policies that are required. So yeah, that's it from me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I very much agree with your last point there. Also on this panel, we have an steel industry representative, Jonas. There is, well, I think today we talked mainly about definitions, but sometimes it's also talk about one definition, that we need one that is kind of, the definition to rule them all. What do you think on that? Is that realistic, or what kinds of different definitions and methodologies do you think both is possible and is necessary?
Yeah, I will try to answer. I like the idea with one standard, that's for sure. But at the same time, we heard in the introduction from Helene Axelsson that it's about maybe 40 initiatives out there right now. And I have been part of that project as well, and I know that the number of initiatives was growing during the project. So I guess it's even more today than it was at that time. But then we also have to remember that it's different purposes for these or those initiatives. So it's not that easy to say that, yeah, it's a big problem that it's 40 or something else. One purpose could be to follow up and to drive the transformation, the green transformation on the global level or national level. That's one thing. And then when we look at the company, it's one purpose to drive the transformation for the whole company or the group. But it's another thing to follow the same thing on product level and follow the carbon footprint and get the number that you can use in the customer dialogue. So all the time we need to fulfill different purposes with this or initiatives and the standards and so on. So and with that said, I think we have to deal with several standards in parallel. We will never get rid of them, so we have to accept that. But at the same time, if we can lower the number of standards for the same purpose, then it would be great. So we can limit the amount of standards. But I don't think that we will have only one of them. So, yeah.
Maybe a key word there is the interoperability as well, so that you can sort of translate between the different results. Follow up on that. How do you think that the industry and other stakeholders, in fact, we very much need the whole supply chain to engage in these discussions, right? How do you think, well, what would be your wish in terms of engagement from the supply chain and policy makers?
Yeah, we have to move on. We have to develop some common understanding, and you mentioned the possibility to translate everything into the same language. If we can have a global language for this, that's the first priority, of course. But if that's not possible, then we need to be able to translate this. But then we need to see how to move forward. And where should we start? And I think that at the same time that I said that, yeah, it will be several standards in parallel, I also think that it will be a stepwise journey towards the solution here. And something needs to happen right now. We cannot wait for the perfect solution that will include everything. I think we have a common view where we will end up at the end of the day. That's quite easy to agree on that, but it's a journey towards that goal. And to make it possible to to reach a result here and now, I think that we need to start with the fundamental parts, with the design of the system, how to measure, how to follow up on the carbon emissions. I also think that we need to narrow the scope for the methodologies. And for us as a steel producer, it could be to stay and to follow the emissions for the crude steel production, for example, or for the slab production. Because if we do that, it will be easier to have a discussion, especially in the industry, because then we are talking about the operations that are quite similar for most of the companies. And if we can agree on how to measure and follow up on that level, we can then in the next step follow up and add on with the downstream operations, with the rolling, heat treatment and so on. So that could be one way to make progress here. And another thing just to have in mind in this work and everything else as well, everyone have to be part of the commitment to contribute to lower emissions. We have different variations or type of steel production, and the easiest way to describe it is that you can produce steel either from the recycled steel scrap or from iron ore. And the starting point of the emissions are on totally different levels. We all know that. But at the same time, if we should deliver on the global climate targets, everyone has to contribute now. No one can wait and say that, yeah, our emissions is so low, so we will have more time. Everyone, the whole industry, need to contribute from the beginning. That's the main thing. And then we have to find a solution for that.
All right, let's see if our next panelist has the solution. I noted Will wants to comment, so I'll come back to you in a second. But first, to Ulrike. ISO plays a very important role in international, in the development of global standards. They are elaborated in a consensus framework, and international standardization contributes to the rationalization of international trade, among many other things. How is ISO currently engaging on climate issues, the green transition of the industry, and the standardization of near-emission steel? Whew, that was a lot.
Well, we've gone through, we have about 25,000 standards in ISO. ISO standard families, I should say, really. And we've gone through those, and we have picked up about 500 that needs to be revised so that we meet the Paris targets. So that is our first commitment doing. Then, of course, when we get initiatives on new standards, we, of course, see to it that they will also point to the Paris Agreement. So we don't start any new standards that are not in line with what we want to achieve going forward. But you have to remember that ISO provides a platform for creating standards. It's not that you call Geneva head office and say, can we have a new steel standard, please? It doesn't work like that. So we have all these experts in the committees, and those 500 committees now that we have prioritized, it's up to those people in that committee to come up with some of the new standards. And I think you all recognize the fact that if you put 40, 50 experts in a room, it might not come out the next day. It takes some time for them to argue and debate and get into a line, because we try to reach for consensus. And I think that is very important, the openness and the consensus-driven thing. And that's why I think all these initiatives are very good that are taking place, because that's created a debate and actually helps push forwards the standards. You might argue that we and ISO would like to have all the initiatives within our platforms, and that would be great, but it won't happen. But there is a debate going on that with all the people listening and discussing that could add into these standards. And we know it takes too long time. People say we can't wait for a standard. And we're working on that now. We are thinking, is there a way that we can release something before it's absolute perfect? Is there a way that we could talk about good enough to give some guidance during the way where we will end up and so on? So we know this. And we've also, as was mentioned before today, we had the international workshop agreement on net zero for companies to start working on. And we are looking, is the international workshop, is that a way to move forward? When we did the COP27 one, we had 1,000 participants from 100 countries in 3.5 months putting forward some guidelines for meeting net zero. And I thought that was pretty fast, to be honest, with such a lot of people being involved. So we recognized the problem with standards being too slow, and we're working on that to see if there is something we can do. But I do appreciate all the initiatives, because that actually pushes standards forward, and some might end up in the platform that ISO provides. Who knows?
Well, let's see, because Will, you had your hand, you wanted to comment or ask a question, so please go ahead. Let's take that now.
Great, no, thanks very much. Also, I just wanted to make 2 points, I think, reacting to kind of other colleagues on the panel. I think that the first thing is on the number of initiatives. So I should declare an interest here, where the IEA is the author of the Breakthrough Agenda report, which has been mentioned a couple of times. And this report aims to better clarify and set out the landscape of initiatives and collaborative forums that exist within different sectors. And we've got a chapter on steel from last year, and we'll be updating that this year. And so one of the things we do is provide a landscape map for stakeholders, which can hopefully provide a slightly more a slightly clearer picture of who is doing what within the sector. And I just wanted to comment that even though there are a very large number of initiatives, that have, a lot of them started even in the last 3 years, I think what that initial slide maybe hides is that there is an encouraging degree of convergence between the approaches that a lot of them are taking, particularly on definitions. So even though there are a lot of them, so for example, the IEA definition that was proposed last year in the G7, I know the IDDI countries have endorsed that and are consulting on that. That is also the basis for the responsible steel definition, and organizations like Steel Zero are taking on board the responsible steel definition. So there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of convergence, and we're kind of moving all in a similar direction. Just wanted to make that point. And then just one other point as well I wanted to clarify for the audience, and I think it was touched on in the first panel, the enabling factors for like measurement methodologies versus the definitions. And I think we all recognize that the definitions point is potentially more politically contentious, it's more difficult, but I think we really can be quite optimistic about what we can do on the enabling factors for measurement methodologies. And from our own work at the IEA, we've been kind of really reassured by a lot of the willingness from stakeholders in China, India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, as I said before, where the bulk of steel demand is growing. So I think we can take the easy and early wins on those kind of enabling factors, and it puts us in much better position to tackle the harder stuff later in the 2020s. Thanks.
Great. That leads me to, it was touched on in the previous panel as well, how to engage the countries India and China, for example, but that's not it. We need of course to have the world around, and in this case in particular the steel producing countries. And we have two organizations in particular here, ISO and UNIDO, who very much have that in your I don't know what you could call it, in your remit, in your definition of your organization. So I don't know, Fiona, if you would like to comment on that, and then maybe Ulrika as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, of course, in order for, let's say, green procurement to be successful, it's critical to make sure that industry can decarbonize in time to sort of provide those products, those low emissions products that the procurement policy is demanding. And the issue, of course, as we're all aware as well, is that the technologies that will deliver those deep emissions reductions are at a relatively early stage of development, and that they are clustered in certain geographies over others. And so to touch on something that Maureen raised in the previous panel as well is, technology access access, skills, and financing aspects as well are really going to be critical for emerging economies in particular. And we need to start today on establishing the infrastructure that's needed to support decarbonization technologies. And this is really what we work on at UNIDO. So through technical cooperation programs, supported by bilateral and multilateral donors, we aim to promote developing countries' participation in the standard setting process, in setting up data collection frameworks, so providing support on measurement, reporting, and verification frameworks, establishing those, but also enabling partnerships and collaboration for low carbon and near zero emissions technology transfer and financing. And so through our convening capacity, we're also working with India as the host of the current G20 to highlight industrial decarbonization needs in different sessions of the Energy Transitions Working Group. Some of that is actually happening this week in Mumbai. And so, wider cooperation definitely needed to accelerate industrial decarbonization. We will be putting forward a series of recommendations in this week's Energy Transition Working Group around the need to implement policies which support market stimulation and really stimulate that demand for low carbon steel, but also beyond that, measurement frameworks, verification frameworks, and sectoral roadmaps for decarbonization.
Okay, Ulrike?
Well, I think the simple answer is that some countries have seen standards as a strategy, and they drive it as a strategy. And I mean, for instance, I met with the trade commissioner in South Korea, and he just wanted to point out that South Korea is now setting standards as a strategy for their exports worldwide, and it's very natural. And I think more countries need to do that, to recognize the fact that standards are a strategy. And some speaker earlier today pointed out that standards should be on the board director level, which they are often in the quality department and not on the strategy department. So I think that is one of the issues. Countries like China, definitely China, has seen this as a strategy. And they take the secretariats they can take to dominate, of course. And it's up to everybody to be there. And when I met the commissioner, your superior, I said, you have to get the European countries to get involved in the international standard system. Ask for the secretariats, lead the way. And that's how you do it. But you have to see it as a strategy, not something that is in the equality department. It's a totally different aspect on standards.
Right, now a lot of different issues have been raised here, and I wanted to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So there's a question there, yeah, in the room.
Hello. Yeah, you can hear me now. Good. Eric Clausen, Ovako here. I was listening in a little bit about our position on the sliding scale was clearly stated earlier, but it was mentioned about aluminium, and I've been asking around but haven't got really the answer. Maybe someone can help me. Aluminium and copper, for example, will they also be treated with a sliding scale? Is that because it's either you take it virgin or you take it recycled, so it's pretty much the same issue.
All right, I'm not sure who is willing to answer this. Maybe Dennis, maybe Matteo. Okay, Ulrike, let's start with you then.
I think there will be for all different kinds of materials. And one thing that we need to know that there are initiatives around in the world, not connected to steel, but to accounting principles, where you have to state in your yearly reports your emissions. And not only backwards, you have to do it forwards as well, especially if you're a European country. The CSRD accounting principles that are being implemented now in a couple of years will ask you, how will your emissions be looking forward? And that is why all materials have to be there. So it goes for copper, it goes for aluminium, it goes for everything. So everybody has to look into that. And the European Union, I think, is the one body that has seen accounting principles as a driver for getting us to be greener and greener. So that will definitely come. If it comes this year, next year, I don't know, but it will definitely come.
Yeah, I think you want to clarify, no? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, please go ahead.
for everything.
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone understands what that means.
The sliding scale, as was introduced here, is that you're allowed to emit more if you use ore, and then less if you use recycled scrap, on a sliding scale. And I mean, aluminium and copper, will they have the same philosophy?
Let's go to Dennis and Angelo, and maybe Will wants to comment quickly on that as well.
Sure, I'm happy to comment on that. I don't know that we're there yet on copper and aluminum. I can say that it feels like it'll probably head in a direction where we have to account for the different ways that companies will approach production there. I understand the concerns about standards as they're understood for, I guess I would draw the distinction between normative standards, which are thresholds to be achieved, and the, as Will put it, the measurement methodologies that they're using in the IEA. I think it's important to draw the distinction between those two things. It's important for us, as other speakers have said, to be clear to industry about how we're measuring things. And I think it's important to be clear about the analytical trade-offs that we are making based on the available data and the method of analysis that is employed to do that. That's really important to give that clarity, right? When it comes to threshold or standards that are, for instance, I won't speak for our U.S. Trade Representative, our Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, but they are looking at threshold standards in terms of where we want industry to drive toward, right? So I think that's an important distinction to make, and I think for us, in terms of, at least for the Department of Energy, in terms of deploying clean energy technologies, we're very focused on the measurement so that we understand what technologies are being effective and where we should prioritize our investments.
I don't know, Angelo, would you like to comment as well?
Yes, also because I think I was the one amongst the one who mentioned aluminium. So I was saying that it's part of the conversation on the global sustainable arrangement. We are discussing how to measure it, but we're still not there yet. So that's why this event is useful. But again, we're still not discussing. We're still not in the phase of discussing measurement on this.
Yeah. Okay. Last comment on this. Well, since IEA was the one putting out this report last year with a suggestion to relate the emissions with the scrap content, or indeed for cement as well, the clinker to cement ratio. So it's not just for steel. I don't know if you have any comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think my comments would be very similar to Dennis's. I think we haven't done the detailed analytical work yet for aluminium and copper as we've done for steel and cement. So I wouldn't want to speak before we've done that. But you can see some of the potential kind of similar principles applying to those two sectors. But as I say, until we've done the kind of the months of detailed work, I wouldn't want to comment specifically on that yet. Thanks.
All right. Are there any? Yeah, there's a question from
the online audience. We had a few questions before the break, and they were skillfully addressed by the panel already, so I won't ask them. But we have one. You mentioned before, or it has been mentioned in this panel, that it takes some time to develop standards. So we have more of a friendly request from the audience out there. That could you maybe elaborate on how, if there's a possibility for different standardization organizations to work together to maybe make the technical progress faster?
to reach out to other organizations, to collaborate and to get them to become liaisons to the different technical committees to make life easier for the stakeholders so everybody knows what everybody is doing out there. So I think that is one of the key issues we work together. And I mentioned accounting before. I'm sorry I misunderstood your question. It's the fact that we have reached out to ISSB, which is International Sustainability Reporting Systems. And you know, we will get that as accounting systems will come, and you will have to be sure that the numbers you are giving in your annual report are correct. And you have to prove that, and you have to do that according to a standard somewhere to say that this is correct. And it will be audited by the auditors. And all of us who have been in companies, we know. We do what the auditor says. So this is a very strong driver, and we need those measurements pretty fast to get those into the annual reports. So this is, it's urgent. Everything is really needs to be up here in front and urgent. And the measurements are the first things that we need to have. And companies will need to have them quite quickly. And that is why we are collaborating with others to make it easier.
That sounds good and promising. Are there any other questions in the room? Maybe? No? Any more online? Or anything you want to know? All right, well, then everything is clear and settled and everyone knows what to do, right? Well, let me do like I did in the last panel. If all of our panelists would like to just name one thing that you either learned from this discussion or one that you want the audience to take away. We have about 5 minutes left, so it needs to be something quite short. So let me start with Jonas and Ulrika, and then we come to you online.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's all about ambitions. What are we going to do here? And I'm very optimistic. You mentioned, I don't know if you used the word fast track or not, but to speed up the process a bit, I think that could be very helpful, and it will strengthen the chance to speed up the green transformation. So I'm optimistic.
I'll take with me all the energy and positive things that have said today. I think it's great to have this huge commitment to actually achieve something. So I think that is something I will carry with me.
Yeah, great. So let me turn to Dennis first.
Sure, and thanks again for this opportunity. I guess I would just say that we have to think about this as a process that will take time, and I think it will also take a lot of engagement and collaboration. I like that previously the breakthrough agenda came through. I thought when that happened, that was a good signal that we need to coordinate across the landscape of efforts that are taking this on in order to get there. But again, I'll reiterate that since it's a process, and I imagine that it'll be a little bit of a marathon, to be honest with you, we have to sprint on decarbonization at the same time with the data that we have and the technologies that we can scale.
Yeah, great. And then Fiona?
Yeah, I can only really echo Dennis's statement. So, I mean, how can we speed up this process? There's been, I get the sense that often the proliferation of initiatives is cited as a negative thing. In fact, I think that, it was mentioned by a previous panelist, actually standards have many different intentions, different spheres of influence, different things that they are governing within this landscape. And so they are all targeted at slightly different things. And I want to highlight the work that the Steel Breakthrough is doing to make sure that these pieces come together in a way that makes sense and avoids duplication of work as well, ensuring that we're building on each other. So we see the Steel Breakthrough as a great mechanism through which to sort of speed up this work and make sure that we're all working towards the same goal.
All right. Angelo?
Really support what panelists have said during the first and the second panel. It was really a pleasure for me to be here, and I've seen so many challenges highlighted, but I also take away that there is optimism and there is a huge commitment, as we said, to advance, and we will work on how to ensure coherence at the European and international level on this, and it's a process which will continue, and I'm hoping that will continue in a positive manner.
All right, Will, you get the last word.
No, thanks very much for the session. It's been really useful for me. I think one of the things that stood out both from the first panel and from this panel, which I thought was great, is that although we're discussing this in Sweden and a lot of the focus has been on EU and US relations and a lot of the initial work under the G7, I think there's a lot of recognition, it seems, from people in the room and people in the panels that we really need to work very collaboratively with emerging and developing countries in particular to make sure that they're brought in early from the start, and that we put in place the mechanisms and the collaborative forums to bring them along with us so we can all move fast enough together. So I thought that was really impressive to see. Thanks.
Okay, great. I think that was all a really good summary of the discussion. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Then I have the pleasure of inviting Annika and Annika up on stage again. So we've had an interesting day, I would say, at least from someone who is deeply involved in the steel industry, a very topical question. And I think we have had excellent panelists who have really put the spotlight on all the different aspects and angles of this issue. So you have both been here listening tentatively throughout the day. So can I ask you for your takeaways or the main things that you think this seminar sort of enlightened or put the spotlight on? You want to go first?
Yeah. I can start. So, well, I think we ended the panels with a lot of optimism. I think I can share that. But looking at my notes, we can start with the customers and the end users, which is also why we need to work on these standards and who are actually going to use them. And they need to understand what is environmentally friendly and understand what actually they're buying. But, to do so, we need to speak with the same language. We have to have common definitions. That will also allow benchmarks and the transparency. But we also heard that it's kind of difficult to actually have one language. So we might have a few, but then it's very important with different translations. Other keywords I think that's been mentioned is that it needs to be fair. We need to be open. We need to be global. So, and we also need to do this together. Everyone, and that is within the industry, but also in the complete supply chain, need to take part, and we need to commit, we need to engage. And we also heard that we maybe also need to make the standards as a strategy. What's also important, which mentioned a lot of time, is the speed. So we need to take the lead. We can't let others to decide what we actually can decide now. So we need to speed up, act now. We can't wait until a perfect solution has appeared. And that will also give a speed to the transition. So why not? Let's start with what we actually can measure, looking at the methods, be fact-based, and get on with it.
Those are excellent words, yeah. Let's see, Annika, what were you having a different angle on this whole discussion, of course. So from your perspective, what would you conclude?
I just start with what Per-Arne said. Steel is of interest of several policy areas, and I think steel is a very important area. Looking into the green transition, sense of urgency, I think we all said, or at least I heard many talking about the sense of urgency that we need to act now. Cooperation and partnerships. All these 40 initiatives or 40 plus initiatives. And then I'm coming to what Ulrika said. ISO is an open platform where all organizations can participate, and it's really a platform for all these initiatives to actually meet and see what can we do together. We need standards. We need standards for measurement, and that's also what I've heard several times today. Actively engagement to find common solutions on measurements. little bit lifting what Matthias was saying, it's the industry that sets the standards. It's all of you that set the standards, not the Commissioner, not the ISO or SIS or SEN. We are there to facilitate. I think that is important. And then I'm coming actually now I'm getting a little bit of my standardization hat on. We have a technical committee in ISO number 17, so you can understand how long it has been there. ISO was created in 1947. Steel, an important area. Japan has the lead. China is there, but not many other countries. So it's actually very much China and Japan that sets the standard. And we have a newly created subcommittee for that one, which is handling the green transition. Also Japan having the secretariat for that. We need to be there. We all need to be there. Europe need to be there, US need to be there. So the whole world need to participate, not only having the standard set by Japan and China. I think I end that. Speed up, we heard speed up, and I would say that requires engagement. Because we as a standardization body can't speed up ourselves. We can have deliverables and tools for that, but we need all the competence of you guys there to speed up. So, thanks.
No, I think those are really the key words of today. Just a little comment from my side on this technical committee 17, because previously I believe they've been working on steel standards, as in composition of materials and so on. But lately, in the last probably 10 or 15 years, they moved into this area around measurement standards. So there's an ISO standard for measuring of CO2 emissions from steel plants. And there is one on life cycle assessment as well that have been developed in that committee. So for the steel companies involved here, I would echo that encouragement to get involved as well. Still, we are active in that committee. Thank you very much for these concluding words. And then I hand over to you.
Sound? Can I speak? Oh, yep. Yes. So, but before ending these seminars, we also would like to thank first the speakers and the panelists. It's very, excellent presentations and contributions. I think actually we have a slide here. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So we want to thank you, and we also would like to thank Åsa for moderating this in a very, very good way. So thanks to you. Yeah. A big applause. So instead of flowers or a present, we would like to give you, we will give you an amount of money that we will then give to Doctors Without Borders. So that will be a present to you all.
Let me then also thank the organizers for organizing this fantastic event. It's been a pleasure to be part of it. I think we've had an excellent audience, and as well online. I'm not sure exactly how many has followed online, but if I believe it was about 200 people who were registered for this event, so I think that's already a success. We're now drawing to a close. This is basically the end. So thank you very much. Again, it has not been said before, perhaps, but this whole event has been recorded. It's going to be available, I believe, both from SIS and Jernkontoret's website. So if you like this event and you'd like to share it with your colleagues, then please feel free to do so once it's up. It's coming in the next few days, perhaps? Yeah, all right. And that's it. So thank you all very much. And, see you in this future work. It will be going on for a while.